official religion of the colony. So those three elements we just talked about have all been revoked in the Dominion of New England. It doesn't go over well. In one of my favorite examples of a protest, the colonists, they actually capture the governor of the Dominion of New England, Governor Andros. They literally put him on a ship and they send him back to England as a, this is how we feel about your dominion, okay? The dominion, it doesn't last very long. It does end ensure that the newly freed African Americans would have citizenship rights. And the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment has been vital in expanding freedom and equality. We see it being used in many discrimination court cases. And the 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights to U.S. citizens regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So again, the 15th Amendment was ensuring that the newly freed African Americans had the right to vote. Now, some southern states, they did find workarounds to the 15th Amendment. They would institute things like poll taxes that required people to pay to be able to vote, or literacy tests that would require individuals to interpret parts of the Constitution. These tests were obviously very biased. The person giving them had all the right to say whether they passed or didn't pass. But what is important is that these Reconstruction Amendments, they were never repealed. They still stand. Besides the loopholes, there was another major flaw in the 15th Amendment, and that is that it doesn't state gender, meaning that women continued to be denied the right to vote until the passing of the 19th Amendment in 1920, at which point women were finally granted suffrage, or the right to vote. The final amendment that helped move our government towards our founding goals was the 24th Amendment, which finally banned the use of poll taxes in order to vote. This was passed in 1964, so during the Civil Rights Movement. Next, we have court cases. One of the most significant court cases in history, and one that we're probably all familiar with when it comes to expanding freedom and equality, is that of Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. So this case is important because it officially overturned the previous Plessy versus Ferguson 1896 case, which had legalized segregation and Jim Crow laws. Brown v. Board, this decision declared that the separate but equal doctrine that came out of the Plessy versus Ferguson case was unconstitutional, and it helped to break down segregation. Gideon versus Wainwright, 1963. This expanded the rights and protections of the accused by providing an attorney to represent the accused. So in the years leading up to this court case, states would only provide attorneys in capital cases. Otherwise, the accused had to pay for an attorney. This disproportionately impacted minority groups and the poor. So the court decided that the right to an attorney was a fundamental right to a fair trial and required all states to provide counsel in criminal cases. Loving versus Virginia, 1967. This expanded marriage rights for interracial couples. Up to this point, many states had laws that banned or prohibited the marriage between whites and people of color. Such laws were viewed as violations of the 14th Amendment. Then we have a collection of court cases: Lawrence v. Texas, 2003, Obergefell versus Hodges, 2015, and Bostick versus Clayton County, 2020. This expanded the protection and rights of LGBTQ members, including marriage rights and the protection against discrimination. And finally, laws. The Immigration and Nationality Act, 1952. This finally repealed earlier acts that restricted immigration and naturalization, particularly of Asian immigrants. And it finally allowed Asian and other non-white immigrants to become naturalized American citizens. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 prohibits sex-based wage discrimination. It ensures equal pay for equal work. So for much of history, men, or at least white men, made significantly more than women for doing the exact same job. For example, during World War II, women working in shipyards, their top pay was about $7 a day, while men made about $22. So again, they're doing the exact same work. This law helped to make sure that pay was equal. The Civil